in Africa and beyond. Warm greetings to all of you, our partners and stakeholders in the audience, and thank you for participating in the just ended opening session of the 7th Annual ReNAPRI Stakeholders Conference. I'm sure we all have something to take back home following the rich statements that have just been delivered by our continental leadership and our partners. So we continue with our proceedings, and we want to invite you all to just sit back and enjoy the rest of the conference, which will be held over the next 3 days. Our webinars, as you heard in the opening session, our webinars are designed to reflect, to reimagine, and reset our policies towards a more resilient agriculture and stronger food systems in the African continent. So we are now in webinar 1, and webinar 1 is designed to reflect on a comprehensive evidence synthesis of the impacts of government policy responses to the COVID-19 pandemic on food trade systems, on food and nutrition security, on livelihoods resilience in sub-Saharan Africa. Comprehensive evidence synthesis is work that was commissioned by the Task Force on Food and Nutrition Security Data and Hunger Hotspots in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. This task force was established under the auspices of the Regional Food Trade Coalition. And some of you may be aware that the Regional Food Trade Coalition is an entity that was launched in September 2019 during the AGRA Green Revolution Forum in Accra, I believe. So the task force is owned and made up of a number of institutions that are involved in the agriculture sector, various institutions, development partners, think tanks, civil society organizations, private sector, etc. So the idea behind this comprehensive evidence synthesis report that will be shared in a minute during this session is to enable all of us to understand better what is working in terms of government policy responses to the impact of COVID-19 and how to address the impacts of the pandemic vis-a-vis regional food trade, food and nutrition security, and how to build inclusive and resilient national and regional food value chains. This session will include a keynote presentation and later a panel discussion. We have 6 discussants for this webinar. The presentation will also include some empirical evidence from Africa and Asia. And this is evidence generated by the Feed the Future Innovation Lab for Food Security Policy, Research, Capacity and Influence, PRCI, and its consortium. So my name is Nalishebo Meebelo. I am the Senior Program Coordinator at the Secretariat of ReNAPRI, and I am co-chair of the task force that I just spoke about earlier on. I have with me my fellow moderator for this webinar, who is Dr. Antoine Bouët from IFPRI, and he is co-chair of the same task force. So we invite you to sit back and receive this pre-recorded presentation, which is being presented by Dr. Andrew Agyei-Holmes. Dr. Holmes is the team leader of the researchers that have put together this synthesis. He's from the Institute of Statistical, Social and Economic Research, ISSER, at the University of Ghana in West Africa. ISSER is a member of the ReNAPRI network. So please sit back and receive this presentation before we continue with the rest of the webinar. Thank you. Okay.
Dr. Nalishebo, apologies for that while we are sorting out the technical issues with the video. Just 1 second.
Hello, everyone. Thanks for this opportunity to share a few thoughts on how the responses of government in SSA to the COVID-19 is impacting food systems. I'm doing this presentation on behalf of a broader team consisting of myself, Andrew, Ayala, John, Emmanuel, Osidia, Amy, Iredele, Tinashe, and Thomas. This team have been working in the last few weeks to put this assignment together. In this presentation, we define the food systems in SSA to include domestic food value chains, food trade on the subcontinent, and food and nutrition security. We also define policy responses to include movement restrictions and safety nets through social protection undertaken by governments during the COVID-19 pandemic. Despite the fact that there have been a lot of writings on this issue, we still do not have a one-stop shop where there is a synthesis of all the findings coming from these papers. Therefore, this presentation seeks to synthesize all the writings that have come out so far and attempt to make some policy recommendations. So we provide a synthesis of the COVID-19 impacts. We also identify the actions which were effective and those which were not. We attempt to make an assessment of the gender inclusiveness and identify some gaps. Mind you, this is work in progress, and this presentation might not provide answers to all the questions we've set for ourselves. As a background, I note that different governments in SSA undertook generally internal movement restrictions. There were some which also suggested that citizens should stay at home. There were also some governments across the continent who insisted closing or partially closing public transport, all in the interest of public health. Similarly, there were social protection policies that were undertaken by some governments. In fact, income support were relatively few. Very few countries did that. There were, however, instances where households were given the opportunity to consume, for instance, utilities for free or pay part. That was quite popular. To understand how these policies, both health and social protection policies, have affected the food systems on the continent, we single out national policies which protected public health, marked in green, and national policies which provided social protection, also marked in green, and examine how they have impacted on domestic food value chains, food trade, and food and nutrition security. To unpack this, we undertook 5 steps. The first of these steps was to search the literature. Second, we screened this literature that we have searched. Third, we coded the literature. Fourth, we described the literature. And finally, we synthesized it. In terms of literature search, We looked at databases. We queried research institutions to see what they had on the topic. We also looked at the websites of international organizations. These literature that we looked up to or looked out for were either gray or peer-reviewed, and they were written in English, French, and in Portuguese. After assembling this literature, we screened them to see if they met our inclusion criteria. And one of the important inclusion criteria was that the paper should have been written on or before 19th of October. They either modeled or empirically measured the impact of policy responses by governments on food systems. And after we agreed on that, 2 people reviewed them to ensure that they met the inclusion criteria. We then coded them to find out what policy responses there were, what were the intentions of those policies, the focus, which subpopulations were they focusing on, and then the impacts on the food system. We then described them, how geographically widespread were they, which topics were important, and then the patterns across outcomes. We finally did our synthesis, which we continue to do, the anchor of our work, to find out the real impact on food systems, and then the types of policies and the extent to which they affected the other teams. Based on these, we make some recommendations. Overall, we are analyzing 58 studies, and that is what we are going to present on today. So in terms of description of the literature, geographically, not all the countries had papers coming out from them. And one of the worrying trends is that for places where food security is an issue, we don't seem to get papers from them, which makes analysis and policy interventions difficult. Take a place like Chad. In terms of analysis, we find that there were significant numbers, 8 out of 10 of the papers we analyzed, which concentrated on quantitative approaches. Similarly, many of the papers were ex post research design. If you think about the specific areas of policy intentions or policy that is examined, mostly the population restrictions were popular, followed by the social protection one. If you think about the farm policy, they are quite. Overall, about 40% of all the papers out of the 58 that we analyzed concentrated on food security and food access. We have 11% thinking about food prices. Agricultural production studies were quite few, 7%. Labor availability was 8%. We tend to have very few papers on import and exports, 7%. Based on these documents, we find that some households, especially those who are farming, are struggling because they cannot find the necessary labor. Those who depend on farming have experienced reduced incomes. Those engaged in other parts of the value chain are also experiencing reduced income. Food security and food access has also been compromised. In terms of how SSA governments responded, we are aware that food aid was quite popular. So thinking of about 14 countries, we realized that 11 out of those 14 undertook food aid programs. There were some which also took tax postponement strategies, and there were a few, also quite significant, about 11 out of the 14, which did some cash transfer arrangement. It's interesting to note that price support or strategies to support farmers were very few. So when we think about the domestic food value chain, how did these policies impact on them? In terms of input supply, we are aware that the supply side has been quite sluggish, and it took longer to transport produce because of checks and restrictions on movement. There were also higher loading and unloading costs. Distribution costs also rose, and that generally affected the uh, food supply and distribution part of the value chain. The agricultural production, for instance, in Ghana and in Kenya, there are reports that there were disruptions in the markets and fewer buyers came to the farmers to produce. We also know that the closure of informal markets also exacerbated income challenges of those who participate in those uh, markets. Processing, transport, and storage. We also find that the activities of middlemen were not as apt as it used to be during the lockdown days. Food vendors report to have experienced declined incomes, and although in other places we see no such thing. In terms of food prices, there are mixed outcomes. In some places, food prices shot up, in other places, they reduced, and in some places, they remain the same. For places where they import and there were border closures, there was scarcity and the prices went up. For places where they export and there were border closures, it means that there was a lot on the market and prices came down. Rural areas in places like Liberia did not experience any food price change. In thinking about the international trade, we are sure that trade flows were hampered, and because of that, input supplies also suffered. And in a place like Mozambique, we see significant challenges coming from the import of inputs, and this has affected agricultural production. Prices of imports and exports um, were also significantly affected. And a case in point is onions, which are imported into Ethiopia from Sudan. There are a significant number of women who also trade across borders in SSE. These women were affected, their jobs were hampered because of the border closures. In terms of food security, we find that availability was curtailed, especially for vegetables in Kenya, etc. Meat product has also decreased in a place like Mali. Access was also hampered with incomes going down. Dietary and nutrition quality, if we look at a place like Zimbabwe, we are told that there were challenges with protein foods. In Nigeria, food security has also suffered, and it is the same in Ethiopia, although this is not very widespread. So what knowledge gaps are we finding? Although many of the studies concentrate on the impact of COVID-19 pandemic, causal effect or causal impact examination is not so much. There is also a depth of knowledge in the impact of social protection policies to mitigate the pain of COVID-19, an area where we believe needs significant attention. We are also talking about the missing middle because we find that research or studies on processors, transporters, and wholesalers is also few, and it's something we need to concentrate on. There's also an over-concentration on the informal market with little effort or attention paid to the supermarket, which is also becoming quite popular. One worrying trend is that some countries are missing in the literature. And here we are thinking about Chad, we are thinking about Guinea, where we also know that food security issues are important. So if we could concentrate on them too, it would be a good thing. So what are the immediate responses being made to address some of the gaps we've identified? We know that the PRCI is conducting phone surveys, which is stratified by rural and urban population. And they are doing this in Kenya, Zambia, Senegal, Nigeria, Mali, and Thailand. The objective is to understand the effects of COVID on consumer food procurement behavior, consumption changes, and then the sources. It is hoped that the data collected will throw more light on citizens' awareness of the COVID-19, disruptions that it brought, and changes in the total household income prior to and post-COVID. This is a good step that we believe can bridge some of the data gaps. Finally, I conclude by saying that the stay-at-home policies disproportionately harm the poor, and so the poor will require some level of social protection. Although some have already been done, we encourage further interventions to protect the poor. With the African Continental Free Trade Area coming into force, we are hoping that it will also help bridge some of the gaps in terms of trade and disruptions of movement of food across borders. Finally, longer-term impacts in terms of ripple effects should be kept in mind because the COVID-19 might continue to affect populations. Thank you very much. As I close, I also encourage you to send us anything that you may have through the emails displayed. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andrew and your team of researchers for this initial step of the final report. Dr. Andrew and his team, for the benefit of our audience, Dr. Andrew and his team are here with us to answer any questions or respond to any of the thoughts that will enable you to further enhance the final comprehensive evidence synthesis. So feel free to ask questions, not only to the panelists, the discussants, but also to the team of experts who have put together this presentation that we've just received. So without much ado, and in the interest of time, because we're trying to catch up on time, I would like to hand over the mic to my co-chair, my co-moderator, Dr. Bouët, who will walk us through the next part of this webinar, which is a panel discussion reacting to the presentation from Dr. Andrew's team. So, Dr. Bouët, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Nalishebo. I hope that you hear me well. And thank you, Andrew, for your very interesting presentation. So we have a panel of 6 discussants, and I will ask each discussant to react to the presentations made by Andrew and to give us their perspective on the subject. So the first discussion is Purva Pandya, who is Chief Executive Officer at the Export Trading Group. So I will give you the floor for 6 minutes. Purva, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Bouët. And I just want to make one little correction. I am a CEO of Export Trading Group Farmers Foundation. I don't want to take Birju's spot. So just that. Very, very good presentation indeed, and a lot of good insights and information that you have gathered. So really applaud to the information you have shared. Just a few first initial response, which while I was listening to you, comes as, you know, the finance part has been overlooked, because if you look at the impact when you talk about the supply chain, and we are talking about the sluggish movement of goods, let's say inputs. Lot of times what we have found, the main reason is also another contributing factor to not having enough inputs for production is lack of financing. We have, because ETG group, the commercial business, we have fertilizer processing facilities, even while I'm sitting in Zambia, sitting in Zimbabwe, Tanzania, Mozambique, across many countries in Africa. But the buying power has reduced, which is also another key factor that is impacting the movement and actually the sales and the agriculture production that you have highlighted. So that is one comment I wanted to share. And in that respect, interestingly, we've been talking to the banks and to the government and asking them that what kind of facilities that you can come up with where the interest rates are affordable for the farmers as well as for the private sectors or any SMEs who are operating within the food system. So that, and this is the area which is, I would like to add in your concluding remarks, that this really requires some attention as well to collect the data. Having said that, another response I would like to make is that while we saw a few issues, obviously initially where nobody, every single day, the policies and the border closures were changing depending on the country's conditions. Overall, and once again, I'm not going to pick on one incident, but overall, when I speak to our logistics team who is operating globally, the policies or the regulatory environment, governments have become a lot more proactive in facilitating trade. So there is that positive side to the story as well, while there are obviously delays for multiple reasons. But what I do want to highlight is the regional discrepancy in the policies. And my one comment, I know I don't want to go over my timeline, but something that I really feel strongly about, and I want to bring that up, is that while we are talking about the African Union and working so hard to bring the free trade agreement across Africa, however, when you are actually operating within the region, each country has certain tendency, and they have been exacerbated by the pandemic, to become very protective of their own national policy and how the trade should free trade and any other movement that is going to impact their own economy and their own population. And this dialogue, when we are talking about the policy, we really want to encourage regional conversations among the policymakers, so that our overall objective about moving the safe and efficient movement of the trade happens even in the neighboring countries. So I think I don't want to go off the time. These are my initial responses, and I'll hand it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Purva. I think that we can have a second discussion right now. Or maybe, Purva, you prefer that Andrew responds right now to your questions about finance and regional discrepancies. I think that Purva had another meeting, and so maybe it would be good, Andrew, if you could react immediately, but not very long, please. Andrew?
Okay, thank you very much. And I'll be brief so that my colleagues can also add on. And in terms of finance, I think you make the point quite clearly, and there's no doubt about that. With shrinking incomes for farm households, definitely making money available to procure inputs becomes problematic. And in fact, last week, in my own institute, we brought together the banks and financial institutions to think about how things could be changed to support farmers to acquire the necessary inputs to do their work. And in one part of the document we present, we show that of all the government assistance which go to everybody in society, those going to farmers, including input support, are fewer. So we definitely need to pay attention. And my colleagues and I have also been deliberating on the point 2, and we are making the point that we agree. And in fact, African governments have done so well in containing the virus and protecting the vulnerable to a very large extent. Will the pandemic make individual countries become protective of their individual country policies? I doubt, but let's see. I think we may want to work hard on that. And I continue to cite the example of onions coming to Ethiopia from Sudan. Because they closed the borders, the prices went up. And the things that Ethiopia had to export and couldn't export, the prices went down and there was a glut. So there is a demand on African government to understand that if we work together as one continent, we could make better gains. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Andrew. And thank you, Purva, for your discussion. I give the floor now to Joel Okwir, who is agricultural economist at the Industry and Agriculture Divisions of the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, COMESA. Joel, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, moderator. I would also like to thank Dr. Andrew and the team for the great presentation. I would largely agree with their findings, but maybe just to add a few things that we have also seen the new actors coming into the agricultural food value chains. For example, in the informal market, we have seen some roadside food vendors. If you moved around in some countries, you see open car booths where people are selling food. And then also we have seen other actors like teachers from private institutions also engaging in agriculture. And I think that demonstrates the adaptive capacity and flexibility of the African population, something I think we need to build on or to harness. The other thing in terms of livestock trade, as a result of closure of the large local markets, we have seen traders adopting new business models where the traders are going for on-farm sale. And this, we think, has implications in terms of logistics and associated costs, which we think will eventually impact on the price the farmers receive, and therefore affecting their income. The other thing is, I think, related to access to services to support agriculture and agri-food system. I think my colleague has already mentioned something to do with the financial services. which in a number of countries was curtailed due to the challenges of providing banking services, given the restrictions, as well as access to extension services. And probably that's an area we need to look further and see how best, given the lessons we have learned from the COVID-19 situation, how best can we embrace the use of digital technology to provide services like extension, financial services, and support the farmers to help them develop their sector. Probably the other thing which we have seen, I think, is both the demand and supply shocks, which I think Andrew presented very well, occasioned by close of schools, hotel, restaurants, and international airports. And this kind of affected specific value chains. And I think Dr. Andrew mentioned onion in Ethiopia, but then also we have other vegetables, fruits export affected, flour export in some of the countries, particularly in East Africa, virtually collapsed, leading to loss of jobs and livelihood, and therefore affecting also the access to food by these particular actors. The other thing is we have got a report of increased informal cross-border trade through non-designated border areas. And this we think has implication in terms of food quality, food safety, as well as has a cost implication to the informal traders, because it is associated with some other illegal charges and barriers. So I think in general, the report captured the key issues related to the impact of the pandemic and the policy responses. Probably the other thing we needed maybe to give deep analysis is the issue of gender analysis to monitor the gender-related impact, to inform the design of policy responses that we think should be able to address the needs and the priority of women and men. And particularly, we need to focus on the rural folk. I think that's what I can say for now. Thank you. Back to you, moderator.
Thank you very much, Joel, and thank you very much for your very interesting remarks. I give the floor now to Daniel Njiwa, who is Head of Regional Food Trade at the Alliance for a Green Revolutions in Africa. Daniel, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you, Antoine. I don't know if you're able to hear me.
Yes, Daniel. Yes, it works.
Great. Let me use this opportunity to quickly, thank ReNAPRI for organizing this session and allowing us to, participate. In particular, also Dr. Nalishebo, and yourself, who are co-chairs of one of the regional food trade coalitions COVID task forces, which is looking at hunger and food security. I think this offers us an additional platform for which we are able to engage with researchers and practitioners on what we are seeing on the landscape as regards lessons that we are learning from this pandemic. But I think importantly, this is a platform that we should be using to really engage our governments, both at regional level as well as at national level, to start to look at things, in a certain way, and perhaps, take decisions that should help put things in the right path. I think what we are seeing from the presentation made by Andrew and his team, which I must commend, very good work, is really an exposure or the revealed fragility of our systems in the marketplace with regards to food, as well as the other agriculture activities. And there's really nothing particularly new in terms of the gaps and in terms of the challenges that we've seen as a result of this COVID shock. It's just an amplification of the challenges that our systems have already. And I must mention that I think as we continue with this work, because I'm sure they're not done, we will need to engage much more closely, in order to draw further lessons, I think, from spaces where perhaps they had little information on. I recall he mentioned, fewer papers were reviewed around issues to do with food trade. And I think that's an area that is critical. And it speaks to also the issue of, how do we address fragility? How do we address resilience of market systems? Should we have more functional food markets? I think some of these challenges that we see could easily be mitigated. But at this point, I think we are in a situation where, at each and every step of the value chain, we see really gaps that are difficult to recover from, especially because we are talking largely about small farmers. We are talking largely about SMEs who provide and perhaps moving 60 to 80% of the food that we need. We are largely talking about informal trade, largely talking about women. All of these sectors put together, just compound the situation that we are in. And I think there is need really to be very, very focused, and perhaps for things that we have probably in a long time not offered really a good eye to or attention to, we really need to take another look at that. But allow me to use the next few minutes to just pinpoint some of the things that I see coming out and emerging from this analysis. And I think from the work that has been presented, we could have, I think, gone a step further in terms of, isolating what are these gaps and therefore what should be done. In terms of the recommendations, we could have been more nimble, to identify those and at least advise our governments. And from where I'm sitting, broadly, there are issues to do with, data. How do governments, react to situations like this? I think we have seen, and in our interactions as AGRA, because we've done also some studies around this work with support from FCDO, formerly DFID, to understand how, to what extent are governments able to look into the ecosystem and be able to make, rational and efficient decisions that could help salvage the challenges that our actors are facing. And to a large extent, the feedback we are getting from the permanent secretaries, other engagements with ministers revealed that really they had, struggle to understand the food security situation, for example. Some of them, that even their strategic grain reserves were not really stocked, or they were not capable to or agile enough to react to the situation. So that is an area where. Sorry.
I think that somebody has not muted his microphone. So during the interventions of Daniel, I would like, and of each discussant, I would like that everybody mutes his microphone. Thank you. Daniel, you have the floor.
Great, thank you so much. I was just talking about the data and the need to strengthen systems for really looking into, food security situation, trade analytics and monitoring prices, being handy for governments to be able to make decisions. And I think the other area that we've seen, and I mentioned earlier, is an issue of, the importance of trade in building resilience for food. And I think this time, having learned and seen, global supply chains failing or slowing down, countries were pretty much looking more to their neighbors than they would look to the international markets. And I think that tells us a story as to how we need to strengthen those, regional supply chains and I think infrastructure that is involved to open up those markets. Informality, we spoke about that, and I think it is high time now we start to look at how do we bring on board, the informal sector, the women into this space, and how can we formalize or bring them into more structured systems? Because once we put those measures and restrictions in place, these groups were the most affected. I think we really need to look into that, including, approaches including around digitization of systems and markets, so that we are able to transact in that sense. And I think I'll end with a point on infrastructure. I think this is a major one, and infrastructure not only in terms of roads or in terms of digital infrastructure, but also infrastructure in terms of handling and storage. I think this is also tied to an issue which is very important in this discussion and has revealed that at the nutritional level, we saw a lot of disruption and perhaps impact in the fruits and vegetables, nutrition dense perishable commodities that could not be stored beyond a certain number of days, that could not be transported quickly to the marketplace. I think this is an area that we need also to divert additional attention to in order to address nutritional challenges in that sense. So let me end there, and I'm happy to come back later to clarify on a few things. But thanks a lot for this effort, and it was a good presentation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I think that you made very important point, in particular concerning trade. This is something I agree completely, and I think that Daniel also made a very important point about data, the need for data, because there are things that we do not see clearly. You see that Purva has added some additional comments on presentations concerning informal trade that has been impacted, and also policy educations and communications efforts. So you can read it in the Zoom webinar chat. So right now I would like to give the floor to the fourth discussant, who is Dr. Medhat El-Elepi, who works at the Agriculture and Business Enabling Environment, Private Sector Development and Finance Divisions of the United Nations Economic Commissions for Africa. Medhat, the floor is yours for 6 minutes.
Yeah, thank you so much, Anthony. And first of all, I would like to express my appreciation being invited to this important panel and to this respected conference to discuss such highly an important event or issue, which is the COVID. As you know, we're living now in the COVID era. And in my humble opinion, I don't think that there is a single shock that has affected food security in Africa as compared to COVID. I believe you're aware that IFPRI has come up with the estimate that food security, the number of chronically undernourished people in the world is going to be increased somewhere between 80 to 120 million as a result of COVID. And the share of Africa out of this figure, we're talking about a minimum of 30 million Africans will be now added to the list of undernourished people in Africa. So to take the whole number of undernourished people in Africa all the way to 280 million, you would agree with me that this is totally not accepted, and we have to do something. We're talking about a prevalence of almost 26% of all Africans. This has wiped out all the gains that have been achieved over the last 20 years and more. So going now to the comments, actually, I can be the fourth in line as a discussant. I can claim safely that most of my comments were addressed by the previous discussant, however, and they left the silly ones to me. But let's go and let's have some look about what I come out of this paper. First of all, I would like to commend Antoine and the team for a very solid paper. The scientific methodology they used is very good, very solid. So it's very commendable. And even the idea to come up with a synthesis paper on what has all the scientific papers that have been working on this field is a very good one. And the task force on food security needs to be commended as well. So let me, without further ado, let me start with my comments. So starting with the title itself. Here I have to recall that I'm coming from academia, basically. If you look at the title, it said evidence synthesis of the impacts of COVID on food systems and food security. I have my own reservation on using the word food systems, because as you know, food system, it refers to the main elements including environment, people, inputs, processes, infrastructure, institutions, and up to my knowledge, this were not analyzed into the paper. The unit of analysis of the paper were the actors of value chains, and it has been repeated a number of times in the slides. So to me, I would suggest that instead of saying food system, let's make it safely, let's use food value chains. This is number one. And the other comment on that stems out of the title as well, which is the coverage as it's seen as sub-Saharan. I would have preferred that the coverage is the whole of Africa. It's not only because I'm coming from an organization that has the mandate, the continental mandate, but because for us, we see that a holistic regional approach to solve food security in Africa is very much required. If you look at North African countries, most of them are some of the world's largest importers of food. So let these imports work to propel agricultural production in Africa. I'll give you one small example. If we were doing assessment of the viability of the establishment of regional value chains between Ethiopia, regional agricultural value chains between Ethiopia and Egypt, we found out that Egypt imports as high as $12.5 billion worth of food annually. If you compare this to the total exports of Ethiopia, total, not agricultural exports, which is about $4 billion. So imagine if Ethiopia only to export 30% of the total agricultural imports of Egypt, we're talking about $4 billion, as much as the total exports. See how much difference it would make at the grassroots smallholders in Ethiopia. So again, I would have wished to include North Africa into this one. Now, my other comment, which is very specific to the objectives and specific to the second objective, it's read as following. Identify what is effective among the various measures that government have put in place. Honestly speaking, I would have loved to see in the last slide in this presentation with the title of recommended or suggested policy options. To me, this would have been the greatest value add of this paper, is you put your brain as what has been working. This is what really, it might be work in progress. I hope this is work in progress because you have access to some of the best 57 papers that talk about COVID in continent. So please share with us this information. Here, I would like to make a reference to slide number 8, which I like it very much, is provide a summary of all the papers that you have analyzed. It said that 14% of the papers that have assessed food security have indicated that food security have improved after COVID. This is very interesting to me. I would love to know what country, what instruments, what measures, what policy measures have been used in order for those papers to claim that food security have been improved. If someone who's coming from a policy advocacy institution, a technical institution as well, we would be in a position to scale out to those measures that have indeed improved, that food security could be improved.
May that only 1 minute, please.
Yes. Yeah. The other thing is when it comes to conceptual framework, there are I can see there are two important elements that were missing into consideration. Like when it comes to national policies to protect public health, would have loved to see the closure of cross borders. As you know, it has so much effects on traders, specifically informal traders. The other missing factor as well under the macroeconomic stresses, which is domestic currency depreciation. I think all of us would agree that it has impact, huge impact on food prices and budget and loans, especially in the case of Africa, where we have 37 African countries are considered as low-income food deficit countries. Yes, finally, and would have been a wish as well. You have wealth of data. We would have appreciated if you could do comparative assessment or comparative analysis, on the impact on food security between, for example, those countries that have applied social protection measures and those who were not applied, who did not apply, or those countries who have applied the restrictions movement against those who did not apply. This would have enriched our understanding of how to better address COVID. And yes, thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Medad, for your very interesting remarks. Now, I would like to give the floor to Marcela McClatchy, who is Program Officer at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. Marcela, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Thank you. Just to start and to echo some of the comments from the other discussants, I want to thank ReNAPRI for their work to organize this event on this critical topic. It's a really essential topic to be discussing right now. And I also want to commend Dr. Andrew on this excellent study and for this contribution to the literature. I think we've all seen case studies on specific impacts and specific geographies, but it's really helpful to have a comprehensive evidence review that aggregates the knowledge from various discrete studies and provides us with a more complete picture of the research that has been available to date. I think this research really highlights the risks that we're seeing, that many of the gains that have been made in poverty alleviation and development over the past decade in sub-Saharan Africa have the potential to be reversed. We've consistently seen decreases in the proportion of people living in extreme poverty, and we've seen increases in self-sufficiency in core staples in many sub-Saharan African countries. We know that this year it's looking like the proportion of people living in extreme poverty has actually increased by 6.5%. So this is a critical issue that we need to get our heads around and understand both the short and long-term implications that COVID-19 is posing. I think the shock also comes at a really pivotal time in the agricultural transformation of many sub-Saharan African countries, as we have seen many value chains transition from more subsistence-based to more commercial, and seen large number of small-scale producers transition from being subsistence farmers to pre-commercial or commercial farmers. And those gains are really important. That also comes with increasing connectivity and reliance on the functioning of domestic value chains that are now at greater risk due to some of the public health measures that have been put in place for COVID-19. And we know that in sub-Saharan Africa, 65 to 80% of food is purchased, and that small-scale producers are food purchasers and consumers. So they're by no means immune from the supply chain challenges that COVID-19 has created. And those most at risk are poor wage earners, particularly urban workers and those working in the informal sector, who are facing increasing income insecurity and higher food costs due to the pandemic and to the supply chain disruptions. And that these risks are particularly acute for nutritious foods and foods that are more perishable and have more sensitive supply chains. So I think, all of these challenges are really important to get our heads around, just in where, at what point we're seeing, these value chains and how COVID is affecting them. I also think this study really highlights the need for improved logistics, transportation, and infrastructure, both for input supply as well as for well-functioning offtake markets. Even before COVID, we knew that storage and transport in sub-Saharan Africa were about 5 times the global average. And so as we think about competitiveness and resilience of the agricultural sector long-term, I think transport and logistics is a key area that will need to be addressed. And COVID really highlights the fragility in some of those areas. I think the study also points to a few areas where we definitely need further data and research. I think, one thing that Dr. Andrew highlighted that I would concur is just the importance of the hidden middle. As agri-food systems are transforming, the post-harvest infrastructure, processors, transporters, traders, et cetera, represent over 50% of the value of the cost in many food value chains. So we really need to better understand how COVID-related policies are affecting this segment of the value chain and what can be done to ensure that their work is not disrupted so that they can provide this kind of critical value to the food chain overall. I also want to echo some of the comments that have been made around the need for better real-time data on supply and demand. I think this has clearly been an ask from many governments and key stakeholders that they need forward-looking predictive data on production and consumption so that they can make key critical decisions around trade, around stock management, around food access and availability, et cetera. I also think we'll need to remain vigilant in understanding the long-term impacts of the pandemic on food availability and farmer income. I think particularly some of the disruptions we're seeing to trade and stockpiling could have longer-term effects that could last for several seasons and could increase volatility for several seasons to come. So staying on top of what's happening in this space will be important, not just this year, but for the next several years as the pandemic gets under control. And I think lastly, I would just say that many of us are here because we really want to understand what can be done. And better understanding the policy recommendations or the contributions that development partners, research institutions, implementing partners, et cetera, can make as governments face hard trade-offs around protecting public health versus opening their economies, will be really important to ensure both short-term food security in the most acute stages of the pandemic, as well as longer-term growth and resilience of the agri-food sector in many sub-Saharan African geographies. So with that, I'd just like to thank Dr. Andrew and ReNAPRI again, and I'll close my remarks there.
Thank you very much, Marcella. You respected the timeline. Thank you very much. And I would like to thank you for your very important remark concerning the need for improving logistics and transportation infrastructure. And also you made the point that we need better data, and in part, and more than that, we need real-time better data. So this is really important. I would like now to give the floor to our last discussant, with Watipazo Mkanda-Wire, who is a Regional Food Markets Advisor at the Foreign Commonwealth Development Office. Watipazo, you have the floor for 6 minutes.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we hear you, Watipazo.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. I'd like to thank ReNAPRI for organizing this meeting, and of course thank the chair and moderator for moderating this panel discussion. Also thanks to Andrew and the team for the study and the presentation earlier on. Just to introduce myself, indeed, I'm Wati Mkanda-Wire. I work for FCDO, and I am a member of the task team on food security. So I am aware of the study, and I've been part and parcel of the discussion. As FCDO, I think I should point out that we are supporting AGRA to implement the Regional Food Trade Program, which is the Food Trade and Resilience Program. And this is where our intervention comes in. Specifically on COVID, we have other programs, but I would like to touch based on the specific COVID interventions that we've made in relation to the study. I will echo what already Daniel has said. That's the advantage of speaking last. I don't have to speak so many things because these have already been stated. As part of our COVID support to AGRA, we are looking at what Daniel talked about. How do we strengthen data collection and analysis on the continent? How do we strengthen advisory support to national and regional governments to be able to use the right instruments after the evidence which is laid before them? And finally, how do we support the actors within the food systems where we can support in the value chains that we are working on? And therefore, this study is key to us, because one of the challenge working with our implementing partners is where do we make the interventions to support those that are struggling or who have been impacted by AGRA. So specifically impacted by COVID. So specifically on the study that has been undertaken, a couple of points that I would want to mention. First, to agree with Puva, who talked about the issue of input challenge, that finance and internal movement played a major role. Maybe one of the things that the study should be looking at is making a distinction between international trade and regional trade. I think the study talks about international trade. If we talk about international trade, we are assuming that we're talking about Africa trading with also other regions. But in this case, I think what is of critical importance is how regional trade has been affected. So if that is isolated as we try to strengthen that study, that will be okay. But I understand, as we could see from the data, that only 7% of the data was on import and exports. But I think this is an area which is critical, because the issues that are affecting regional trade, as we have seen, are completely different or many different from what is impacting on the international trade. The other area I would want to mention is on the balance between how we look at food security vis-a-vis the markets. If you look at the policy issues that have been raised in this study, mostly are touching on the social aspect, which is the food security, and very, very few are touching on the impact on regional trade. Policies, for example, that countries have been implementing on export bans and some of the taxes that they're putting as a result of trying to contain the situation. So I think if that relationship can be established, I think it would be much better to understand what is going on. The issue of informal trade versus structured trade, I think, is also quite critical. I think it has already been mentioned. Informal trade, yes, is critical for our region, but at the same time, if we are to make the conclusion like the study has made to say the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement will be critical, the conclusion doesn't come very well, because most of it we are talking about the informal trade. We've not seen whether Africa indeed is trading in food and what the impact has been following COVID. So I think that area will need to be strengthened in terms of how we're going to make those conclusions. Maybe in closing, I think Daniel raised a couple of key important points on the work that they've been doing and some of the things that they've found. One is the importance of the supportive physical infrastructure, which has been impacted on as a result of COVID. Secondly is the vulnerability of the food market system, which has especially exposing the weak transport and logistics services because of the COVID. And this has impacted on things like inputs and etc. So that is an area where it has been impacted, and how do we, whether policy-wise or otherwise, how do we influence those structures to be strengthened? Lastly, I think on the support institutions themselves, one of the most visible things that have happened is that when the COVID rules have been put in place, you could see institutions struggling in terms of implementing some of the measures. That's why you've had long queues of trucks, acceptance of the COVID certificates, and how do you react to those? Those are some of the policy measures that have been instituted that have impacted, at least from the regional food trade perspective. Those are some of the things that I wanted to share with you. And as Daniel said, I think some of the policy instruments that countries can use to help on increasing regional food trade are the things that they are working on, whether looking at the regional food balance sheet, as well as the strategic grain reserves. That's where we think we should be supporting each other to support countries to strengthen those instruments. Let me stop there. Over to you, moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Tipazo. You have brilliantly made some suggestions and remarks about Andrew's report. Nalishebo, I think that I have to give you the floor now for in fact, managing the Q&A sessions, or do you want me to do it?
Yes, please. Thank you very much, co-chair, co-moderator. You were great. And thank you to all the discussants for those very insightful interventions. We can see already that this is a very interesting conversation, and it is not a conversation that can be concluded today. Through the Conference IO platform, those of you who have engaged the Conference IO platform, your questions are being answered in real time. So please ask your questions. I'm sure if you direct them to someone specifically, you might get an answer in real time. This conversation will continue beyond this conference through ReNAPRI and through the task force. So please continue to send in your questions. Please continue to send in your thoughts. And we will continue to help our experts to hone their report so that when they provide us a final report, it will be a good and finalized report. So in the interest of time, I'm going to ask one question to COMESA very quickly. Joel, the recent COMESA ministerial meeting endorsed what you called the COMESA COVID Action Plan. Could you just briefly enlighten us on the content of that COMESA COVID Action Plan in relation to this theme today? And then after Joel comes in to respond to that question, I will ask the rest of our panelists, our discussants, to just begin to wrap up very quickly with 1 minute intervention, because we've really run out of time and into the time of the next session. But rest assured, this is a live conversation and it will continue. Please send us your thoughts, send us your questions if they have not been answered on the Conference IO platform. So Joel, if you could quickly answer that question for us from COMESA, thank you.
Thank you, moderator. Yes, COMESA developed together with our member states and partners, developed a regional COVID-19 food and nutrition response plan, which is basically designed to address immediate, or what you call short-term food and nutrition security and livelihood needs of vulnerable population. But also it looks at the medium-term food security and livelihood and economic needs of the population within the region. And then also it goes further to integrate some of the interventions into the long-term regional agriculture development and integration again. So it has a number of strategic priority areas that include boosting agriculture productivity, increasing regional market access and trade, strengthening enabling regional policy and regulation, and building resilience of agriculture, agri-food systems and ecological biodiversity. One other area it prioritizes strengthening regional coordination and strategic partnership. Building resilience, a number of interventions we are looking at. One area we're emphasizing is research, support to research to develop some technologies, innovation, and practices that help to build resilience of our agri-food systems. The other area is looking at coming up with mechanisms to reduce overall risk faced by farmers and private investors in agriculture and other value chain actors through a number of interventions, including value chains, financing, looking at the option of crop insurance and all that. So in a nutshell, that is what the response plan is all about. And it emphasizes, as I mentioned, strengthening coordination and strategic partnership. And COMESA is open to enter into partnership with all the institutions that will want to work with us so that we're able to deliver on the plan. Thank you, moderator. Thank you.
Thank you, Joel. That was very insightful. Very quickly, let me move to you, Medat, from UNECA. Could you kindly, in a few minutes, just tell us about what UNECA is doing to support African Union countries to respond to the COVID-19 pandemic?
Yeah, thank you so much. As a matter of fact, we provide, together with the Afrimix Bank, we have established an initiative that help African countries to mitigate the food security impacts of COVID. So we're talking about a facility of $3 billion. So we have been helping a number of African countries to submit proposals, to get into, to have opportunity to be considered for this facility. And the other thing is we have come up with different documents for policy advocacy as on related to the impact of COVID on food security. Interestingly as well, we have started a project on agro-poles and agro-parks. You may ask why agro-poles and agro-parks, but we do believe that agro-processing in Africa strengthen the the resilience capacity of African economies. It's as you've seen it from COVID at the moment, it has been very evident that the industrial base in most of the African countries is very weak. This is
Have we lost you, Medat? Sorry, I think we have lost Medat, or can you hear me?
is very original.
Oh, good, he's back.
Yeah, sorry. The last thing that I would like to mention here, that we do believe that regional integration is very crucial, not only to achieve food security from a holistic perspective, but also to advance agricultural transformation in Africa. This is why we're doing intensive work on regional value chains, because we do believe that this is an effective means to strengthen regional intra-Africa agricultural trade. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Daniel, the next question is to you, but please turn on your camera if you can. What do you think needs to be done to address immediate to the long-term effects of COVID-19 in food trade? Because I know the task force is focusing on food trade.
Thank you, Nalishebo. And I mean, that's quite a loaded question. I mean, as AGRA and its partners in the PIATA framework, I think we are, looking at this issue with the seriousness that it deserves. I'd like to acknowledge again FCDO, USAID, BMGF, BMZ, Rockefeller Foundation as some of the supporters of the work that we're doing in AGRA, in order to improve our regional food markets, but also agriculture, inclusive agriculture transformation in general. So I think for me, it goes down to the gaps that we're seeing, and like I mentioned earlier, what the gaps we're seeing now are just a revelation of the gaps that have always been there. And I think first things first, what COVID has helped us do is perhaps to add, go into a higher gear to address some of the immediate needs. And for me, it is about decision making. It is about creating a policy environment where markets are able to function efficiently. And how do we achieve this? And we go back to the issue of data, we go back to the issue of evidence, and to what extent governments are able to use this data, tap into it, and make decisions. All of this gives confidence to the markets. And besides that, I think there's need to be a lot of engagement, I mean, between all of the value chain players, I mean, actors. AGRA has provided several platforms in that direction, including the AGRA and now the Regional Food Trade Coalition, where even regional economic communities are invited. Business captains sit there, national governments and other partners, to share ideas and coordinate our investments and initiatives. I mean, if one typical example that I can share right now and quickly, I mean, if you look at the immediate effects of the COVID, by stopping markets, by closing markets, the biggest sufferers were the small traders. And you see that supermarkets, and the study actually validates that, we're still operating. And what that tells you is, if you get these small players and small businesses, the hidden middle, as we call it in AGRA, better organized and participate in regional value chains, better coordinated with those who are aggregating at the high level across the border, the processors, then we're sending a right signal in the market, and we're able to communicate and transfer incentives that will benefit everyone along the chain. So really, these are some of the things that we need to do. And on my last point will be that, I mean, we have an opportunity here at our hands with the launch of the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, which just expands the market beyond the small regional groups that we have. And we know we have challenges in those subgroupings. But I think what is important are the lessons that in our small way, I mean, in the investments that we're making through regional food balance sheet, effort around SGR, data collection and food monitoring, can we bring these lessons at a larger scale, at a larger platform in the Africa Continental Free Trade Area, and share those lessons and successes, and then bring them to scale? I think this is a way to go, and this is a way to build more resilient food systems that will not fall to shocks in the immediate future. Thank you.
Thank you, Daniel. Great decision-making and policy environments that will ensure functional markets. So now I'd like to ask Purva to just give us her last words in 1 minute, Purva, if that is possible.
Hi, Nalishebo. Thank you very much. Yes. And you know, it's been such a rich conversation, and just listening to all the speakers and feedback, there's similar thoughts, you know, that has been going on in my head as well, and our internal conversations on the private sector side. So I just want to quickly highlight that I think this all the points Daniel made, Dr. Medhat made, and other speakers have made is about, I think, regional dialogue. And of course, I'm talking, of course, at the AU level as well, is really, really needed, because I just give you one example that the lifting export ban by the Tanzanian government on rice, it has incredibly and positively impacted the rice production in the country, where farmers, small-scale farmers now actually are making rice profitable, because they made sure that there was import parity, the local production was well protected. Similarly, in Mozambique, another example of the good policy and supporting the food systems, which I rightfully agree that that is includes agro-processing and all the actors, is where in Africa we are hugely dependent on importation of machinery because we don't manufacture as much, and importation and the taxation, all the duties, and it becomes horrendous and unaffordable. And I think some of those incentives, lifting some of those import duty bans, and all those certain proactive policies on parts of the government have helped in that country, while the neighboring country does not necessarily follow the same, and you see the result of reduced processing. And just my last comment, that which really is important for us to remember, the president of African Development Bank, Dr. Adesina, said that $35 billion of import now on the continent is likely to go up to $110 billion by 2025. So how do we make the policymakers and all the actors, we can bring that together and create the positive policy environment that is gonna allow the food systems to thrive? I think that is the vision. So having said that, thanks very much for having me. I will move on to my other meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Purva. You've been great. And what I've taken from your intervention is that we need to ensure that we continue to have those high-level discussions at the African continental level. So very quickly, Watipaso, your last comment in 1 minute as we wrap up this session. And just to let the task force members who are here, let them know that the next task force meeting will join that meeting. So Wati, over to you.
Thank you, Nalishebo. 3 quick points. One, I think going forward, we have to consolidate the regional food security agenda. I think instead of looking at concentrating on national food security, we should look at why it is critical to look at a regional food security agenda. That becomes critical, and therefore the role of institutions like the REX becomes even more important in terms of the engagement. Number 2 is that to be able to do that, we need data. As we could see from the studies that have been done, there seems to be very, very few studies being done on food trade. And we are in the process of moving to Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement, and yet we don't know how we are trading amongst ourselves in a structured way. So I think this is a challenge to ReNAPRI and others who are in that research field. How can we consolidate collection of this data to inform policymakers and to inform the private sector and the market in terms of what can be traded, what is profitable, what is happening on the region? Without that, it's very difficult to see that the Africa Free Trade Agreement will mean a lot going forward. The third element, and more important, is the importance of partnerships. I think partnerships will continue to be critical. We can't do things on our own. There's a lot of duplication of efforts and doing so many parallel and conflicting things. We have to bring cohesion, and that can only be brought about with emphasis on partnerships. I think the Regional Food Trade Coalition is one such thing that AGRA is trying to do to bring everybody around the table and coexist and co-invest in things. And secondly, we are part of the PIATA partnership of inclusive agriculture transformation in Africa with USAID, BMZ, Gates and Rockefeller Foundation and AGRA. This is a platform where we've seen consolidation of our resources investing in the agriculture space. I think those 3 points is what I would like to leave with the audience here. Thank you.
Yeah. So thank you to all the panelists. Thank you for your time. I'd like to now hand over to my co-chair, Dr. Antoine Bouët, to help with the closing of this session. Dr. Antoine.
Thank you very much, Nalishebo, and thank you very much for all for Andrew and all the authors of this report, very important report. Also, thank you very much for the discussion. I think that one point which emerged is, of course, the importance of trade, but also the importance of data. I would like to say that we have just released at IFPRI the Africa Agriculture Trade Monitor, which is about trade statistics in Africa. We try to improve the quality of data on trade in Africa. And so I think it's really important. And it's also important to have information on policies. And I think that information on, in particular, on import duties is relatively good, but on export restrictions and export taxes is missing. And so I think what is important also is to have a predictable environment for operators, because it's important to lift export bans, but it is also important to operate in a predictable environment. I would like to say that there are many questions that are in the chat box, and of course they will be sent to the authors of the report and they will help to shape the report. So thank you very much to everybody, and I think that we have done a very interesting workshop for this, and I would like to thank Nalishebo for the organization of these discussions. Thank you, Nalishebo. Over to you.
Thank you. So thank you to the audience. Thank you everyone for linking into this particular session.